Hello, this is Eric Morris Eskenazi. I'm the host of the Iraq Dispatches podcast. Thanks for tuning into this latest episode in which I interview Helen Zuman, who's the author of Mating in Captivity. Helen is a graduate of Harvard, and during her 20s, she spent a period at the Zendik Farm. Her book, Mating in Captivity, chronicles her experiences being part of an alternate community and then later learning on that this community was actually a cult. Hello, thanks for listening to the Erratic Dispatches podcast. We'll be back shortly after a brief break. Hello, I've been using Anchor.fm now for about almost a year for the podcast Erratic Dispatches, which is distributed through Anchor.fm. It's completely free to use, very easy, and any audio that you upload or record through the website, it will be you can use it to organize your audio files, and once your podcasts are ready to submit, it will be available to stream within at least 8 different streaming sites. Helen, do you mind starting off with how did you begin writing your book about your experience being in is it pronounced, is it Zendik? Is that how
Yeah.
it was?
Yeah.
Do you mind talking a little bit about that, and how many years did you work on it, and what kind of research besides your own did you input in the book?
Yeah. So I started writing it in January of 2006. The impulse to write it arrived after I had gotten the memo that Zendik was a cult. It took me about 14 months after I left to understand that. So in those 14 months, I had been dragging this weight behind me, feeling like I was doomed because I had failed at the one thing on earth that was worth doing. So when this weight finally lifted, I felt that I had received 2 different miracles. One was that I had created this fantasy world, in tandem with all these other people and lived in it for 5 years. Well, in a sense, 6 years. And the other one was that I was free, and I was absolutely elated, and I felt this was incredible. And I also thought that, no one who didn't live at Zendik is really going to understand how this worked or what happened unless I tell the full story. Like, this is not a short story, this is a book. So I started in January 2006. I signed up for, a memoir writing class just to get myself going. And it took me from then to when the book was published, it was more than 12 years. It came out in May 2018. So, as I was writing the book, I was learning how to write a book. I was also learning how to interact with writing as a process instead of just a perfectionist fantasy where I wanted everything to be perfect on the first draft and then stop myself up from producing anything. As far as research, I had tons of conversations with other former Zendiks, just in the years after leaving, and most of those conversations were just, we're friends, we're talking, we're processing. But in some cases, I did specifically ask friends, in particular friends who had arrived at the farm many years before I had, and who had experienced the leaders, Errol and Wolf, in ways that I hadn't. I did ask them specific questions about, things that I couldn't have known about. And then I did research. Like, there was one concert that I went to as a Zendik seller that happened right near a pivotal moment in my journey through the Ferris wheel of the Zendik hierarchy. And because I did research on that concert and found out exactly what had happened, I was able to make a connection about this pivotal event that I wouldn't have figured out otherwise. But yeah, it was mostly, just really digging into my own experience. That was the material for the book.
Before reading your book, I wasn't aware of Zendik. I read from others. I was doing some research about it online, and people said that sometimes they would go to
like different rock concerts like Metallica or whatever, and there'd be people there from Zendik like selling T-shirts, or they would give out the cassettes there. So they were, I guess, they were pretty like widespread and going to all kinds of events, around the country.
Yeah, I mean, for I think probably starting in the 1970s. I think that was when Zendik first started producing a magazine. It was just
Mm-hmm.
this one page, purple mimeographed sheet, maybe it was a couple pages, called The Cosmic Revolutionist. And in the beginning, what I heard was they were just sort of using it. It was partly as a way to make money, but also just as a way to meet people
Mm-hmm.
because they didn't want to do the normal, like, go to a bar. So they would go
Mm-hmm.
to a health food store parking lot instead, and like,
Mm-hmm.
and approach people with this magazine. And then over the years, the magazine expanded and got, full, color covers and so on. And the Zendik started producing tapes and CDs and bumper
Mm-hmm.
stickers and T-shirts and so on. And I think maybe in the 80s or the 90s, they followed the Grateful Dead,
Mm-hmm.
and in my time, we would, we would go to Fish concerts and stuff like
Mm-hmm.
that. But yeah, we would go to Ozfest and
Mm-hmm.
Metallica, and
Mm-hmm.
I mean, sometimes we also went to Bruce Springsteen concerts. It was
Mm-hmm.
just there were a lot of different crowds that
Mm-hmm.
we were able to connect with by sort of talking about different
Mm-hmm.
aspects of what we believed in. But yeah, I mean, for 40 years, Zendiks were out on the streets and at concerts and festivals,
Mm-hmm.
talking to people.
And in your book, I remember reading about like the sort of like pressure, I guess, to try to sell like a certain amount of T-shirts, within the weekends and that sort of thing. But like during those different periods when you're selling, did you ever meet people that end up coming like later on to the farm that you're at?
Yeah, yeah. Some people did come to the farm after meeting
Mm-hmm.
Zendiks on selling trips. I'm not sure if I remember particular people who that happened with,
Mm-hmm.
but I mean, mostly, especially in my time, selling it was like 90% about making money and maybe 10% about recruiting,
Mm-hmm.
finding people.
And then like through the website that they maintain at the time, I guess, did they ever like recruit people through there as well before it was like shut down?
Well, I think the website was maybe part of the recruitment
Mm-hmm.
process or the self-recruitment process for some people. I mean, that's what I did. As soon
Mm-hmm.
as right after I found the listing in the communities directory, I went to the library in
Mm-hmm.
1999 and
Mm-hmm.
looked up the website, and it did kind of bring me a little closer because
Mm-hmm.
what I read on the website, in particular, this one essay talking about how we were all living in a big lie,
Mm-hmm.
resonated with me and made me interested in taking the next step of calling the farm,
Mm-hmm.
and setting up a visit. So, but I don't think, I mean, yeah, I think it was part of the process for some people, probably, but oh, well, there was something else that happened in the early 2000s. The Zendik started a forum
Mm-hmm.
through which outsiders could interact with us. And the idea, Errol's idea behind the forum was that we were going to be, dropping knowledge on the civilians, and
Mm-hmm.
they were going to be really excited to get like, personal interaction with us. And there may have been a way in which that was meant to bring people in. But what actually happened was that some people got critical
Mm-hmm.
and on the forum, and Errol didn't like that, so
Mm-hmm.
she shut it down.
Mm-hmm. And like so far since your book came out, like have you been approached by people that had previously belonged to other organizations, or organizations or collectives that later on they found out that it was like a cult, and have they ever like wrote to you about their own like similar experiences?
Yeah, I've gotten a fair number of emails along those lines,
Mm-hmm.
and also just like met people in person who've been
Mm-hmm.
like, yeah, I was in a group that was similar. I remember getting an email from someone maybe a couple years ago who she hadn't even read my book. She had just read an article that I had written for Communities Magazine about sexuality at Zendik Farm.
Mhm.
And she said just reading that article kind of put in relief her own experience at the community that she was part of. And she like wasn't even, she did not want to read the book. It was too much for her, but she just had this really strong feeling of resonance between her story and mine that helped her see that, you know, the place that she was living was really not so good for her.
And have you like since the book came out, have you been interviewed or profiled like any kind of documentaries, you know, where they've interviewed people that were formerly part of like cults?
Well, I've been interviewed for a bunch of, you know, podcasts and, you know, video, videos, stuff like that. I would say probably the closest thing that anyone has made to a documentary featuring me was this like 9.5 minute video on Vice UK that, you know, included some additional footage of the farm and stuff about it, but was mostly just me talking. I mean, you know, I was just talking recently with a fellow ex-Zendik about this. Like, it would be awesome if someone made a documentary about Zendik, and there is a lot of archival material available. It would be great if that would end up in a college library somewhere. But I mean, yeah, I think Zendik really is kind of significant in the sense that it you know, it started in the 60s as part of the counterculture and the hippie movement, and it lasted for more than 40 years. You know, and it kind of was a confluence of a lot of, you know, currents in American history. I mean, Woolf talked about ecocide, you know, and the suicidity and people, you know, destroying the web of life, you know, long before that was common currency. So there's that. There's also, you know, this attempt at treating sexuality in a different way, which was like quite coercive and quite screwed up, but also that's also something that various groups throughout history have been, you know, trying and struggling with.
And like since the book, or even since leaving Zendik and then writing the book, like, do you feel like with your experience being involved in there, do you feel kind of like, if you don't mind talking about it, do you feel like kind of neutral with your feelings about it, or do you feel like you were glad to be, you know, in there when you were, you know, younger, like college, post-college, or like how do you feel when you look back to that time period? Like it was about like 20 years ago or 20 or so more years ago?
Yeah. Well, I showed up 22 years ago and I left 17 years ago. I mean, the answer to that question has changed a lot, you know, in those 17 years. And I never regretted having gone there and lived there. I was always aware of kind of the yields that I had gotten from the experience. I see my time at Zendik as dividing my life into before and after. You know, there was just so much that happened there that I've, you know, composted since then into a source of fertility. At this point, and, you know, for quite some time, I mean, I've always been very glad that I got out, you know, that I got out when I did. I mean, the farm lasted another 9 years. So I could have stayed another 9 years, and I'm really glad that I didn't. I'm glad that I got out. And I'm glad, more importantly, that I freed myself mentally and emotionally. And I am incredibly grateful for the experience because of everything that it taught me, because of the particular lens on human nature that I got from being there, and because of all the incredible friends I made and the people that I got to know that I don't think I ever would have encountered in any other way.
Mm-hmm. And so I guess you still keep in touch with a lot of the people that you were living with at that time.
Yeah. I mean, so many of my closest friends are my fellow ex-Zendiks. And of course, they're scattered across the country. So I don't necessarily see them very often. But when we do get together, it's as if no time at all has passed. And there's just a certain kind of bond that I formed with those people that could be akin to what happens when, people fight in wars together. I don't know, because I haven't done that. But I think there's that element of those friendships. But I think another commonality, another thing that binds us to each other is just that we were all people who went and did this crazy thing in defiance of what we were supposed to do to, walk down the path toward success in the American way. And I think there's like this seeking, questing, adventurous quality about many of the people who lived there that is still very much alive and makes for, lots of vibrant exploration when we get together.
And were there any like former members that you've been in touch with that maybe had some experiences there that were, I don't know how you would put this, like more extreme? Maybe they've had some pretty, like, especially regards when they go on the walks with people, or maybe like, similar to you, like being a virgin when you came there and then, slowly becoming sexual for the first time. Do anybody have like worse experiences than you there?
Well, I mean, possibly. What comes immediately to mind when you ask that question is the experience of women in particular who gave birth at Zendik. There was a longstanding tradition of mothers getting separated from their children. And that may have been the most harrowing thing that happened to anybody there. I mean, if it's possible to quantify harrowingness, and that didn't happen to me. So it's possible that was worse. And, and at the same time, well, it's hard to say, because it would vary from person to person, how they felt then and how they see the experience now.
And do you have most of the people that you've been in touch with, I mean, they were able to live life happily afterwards, or do you think some of them kind of wish that maybe Zendik was still around, that they could still be part of that community?
Well, I can think of one person who seems to really still believe in the Zendik philosophy. And I would say also that this person has managed to create a post-Zendik life for herself. I mean, as far as people being happy, I mean, I don't really see happiness as the goal of my life. I just want to be as alive as I possibly can and aware of what I'm up to. For the most part, I would say that the people I know who've left Zendik have, just gone on to recreate themselves. In some cases, people like had a dream or an ambition that they were not able to fulfill at Zendik, because Zendik was not super friendly often, especially people's artistic ambitions. But and then after leaving, we're able to go ahead and make that happen. I mean, that's kind of the case with me. I was always very interested in writing, but it wasn't that easy to develop that at Zendik. And then once I left, I was able to. But yeah, people have gone on to create successful businesses. Some people who had not gone to college I mean, most people who went to Zendik hadn't graduated from college, then started college in their 20s, like much later, and like really seriously enjoyed it and got a lot out of it because they weren't just doing it by rote. They had, gotten to know themselves well enough to know, like, yeah, I really want to do this. This is worth it to me. These are the reasons why I'm doing it, and I'm going to really, really give it everything. And then another aspect of the post-Zendik experience has to do with relationships, like romantic relationships, which were so tightly controlled there. So then that's another kind of interesting thing to grapple with later on. There are a number of couples who have now been together for, a decade or more, who originally met at Zendik and have formed really strong bonds, in defiance of what Zendik allowed, which was you're not allowed to bond for life.
Like I was, I went on YouTube recently. I know that they've uploaded like some of the music from the Zendik, like the band, whatever, like just like from the 70s. So when you were there, was there like a community of musicians there, like recording music there at the farm?
Yeah. So I arrived shortly after Wolf died. When Wolf was alive and well, he was in charge of the band. He was the lead singer and everything. Errol took over that role from him. She started singing, and so she was in charge of the band. So when I was there, she was the band leader, and there was a rotating cast of musicians, people just cycling in and out. The band got together to play, fairly frequently. The music was all improvised, which, could be a liability. But yeah, they would get together periodically and play. And, the musicians cycling in and out sometimes had to do with their skill as musicians, but I think more often had to do with just Errol's opinions of them and whether they belonged in the doghouse at that moment or not. So there were some really talented musicians, and they, didn't all necessarily get to really express or develop those. I mean, I think it was a mixed bag. I think to some degree they were able to develop their skills and their talents, and and in some cases, Errol that wasn't her main concern. Like making quality music wasn't necessarily her main concern.
And is there like any kind of like film or video documentation that exists of Zendik?
Well, there are a couple. There are at least a few, shorter documentary pieces on YouTube where people actually went to the farm and filmed while they were there. Wolf had a public access TV show when the farm was in Austin in the 90s. So there's plenty of, I don't know if it's video or audio or both, but plenty of footage of him talking. And then there was a Zendik TV show. There's, lots of video of that. Yeah, that's about, what I can think of in terms of documentation.
And Helen, do you mind discussing about like before you discovered Zendik, like you were kind of testing out like other communities at the time. Do you mind like talking a little bit about that and what made you interested in doing that?
Yeah, so when I graduated from Harvard in 1999 with a degree in visual art and a grant to explore intentional communities. In particular, I was interested in kind of learning about the basics of life, like how do you grow food and how do you get water and how do you build shelter, just these practical things that were not covered in my education. So I was interested in that. I was also really interested in just being part of a community. In my last year at college, I moved into this off-campus house called the Dudley Co-op, which was kind of where the misfits went. And it was very different from the Harvard dorms, the regular dorms. In the regular dorms, everything was taken care of for you, your meals, and someone came and cleaned your bathroom, and you just didn't have to do anything for yourself. And at the co-op, we ordered our own food, we cooked for ourselves, we cleaned for ourselves. We even had a compost bin out back that I took care of. And there was just this level of camaraderie that came out of not only being misfits, but also cooperating to take care of ourselves to some degree. And I think that was the first time in my life that I really felt like I belonged somewhere. And so in a sense, I went off looking for a more permanent version of that experience. And also, like, I remember in 1989 in September going to see The Matrix and just having this like full body visceral reaction, like, yes, I am in the Matrix and I have to get the hell out. Just in the sense of like, yeah, even what Zendik said, everybody is lying all the time. Everybody's just being polite and putting on this skin of civility, and it's not real. And I was like, and then Zendik's all about honesty. So anyway, so I had that feeling about like, I just want to like bust through this false surface way of interacting. And then looking around at my classmates who were going into banking or going to graduate school or going to law school or being doctors or whatever, none of it made sense to me. I was like, world's fucked up. It's this, life chopping machine. And I'm supposed to just get on the machine and help it run. Like, no, I don't think so. So that's kind of what got me going on my journey. And at first I went out west. A year earlier, I had taken a year off from school. And towards the end of that year off, I'd ended up at a place in Arizona called the Rivas Mountain School of Self-Reliance, out in the Superstition Wilderness, totally off the grid. So I went back there first for a few weeks. I went to a place called Alpha Farm out in Oregon. It's one of the older communities. It's been around for maybe 30 years. I went to visit the Zen Farm at Green Gulch. I had a friend from college who had grown up there, and maybe I might have been to a couple other places. But and then when I came back to New York, I went to Ganas, which is a community on Staten Island. But in all, like at the place in Arizona, it was very small. There were just a few people living there. It wasn't this sort of thriving collective scene. And there was, well, I'll just leave it at that. And the place in Alpha Farm in Oregon, I remember, going there, and I was told to go to the garden and give it my love energy because they didn't really know what to do with me. And Ganas it seemed they were doing something they called feedback therapy, and it seemed kind of strange. And also Ganas is not really a rural place, and I think I was more interested in that. So yeah, so none of the places that I went to check out in the first few months after graduation, none of them really caught me, in terms of the people or the belief system or anything. And so then when I was back in Brooklyn in the fall, I, got out the communities directory again and started looking, and there was Zendik, and it seemed to answer a lot of the objections I had to the other places, in the sense, like, they had an apprenticeship program and they were looking for new people, and there were a lot of them, and they were mostly young, and there were not just food growing and practical skills that you could learn, but they were also into art. So it seemed kind of perfect for me, and it also seemed like weird and dark and mysterious. And I thought that was cool too.
And I guess most of the people that were either at Zendik or different collectives, they just wanted to, I guess they wanted to either rebel or just not be part of the whole corporate evil world. it's like finding a utopia outside of that.
Yeah, I think that's part of what was going on, and yet, of course, escape is impossible. I mean, the most glaring example of that is just money. You know, like the term self-sufficiency is kind of ridiculous. People used to ask us, when I lived at Zendik, like, are you self-sufficient? Like, don't even bother asking, because no human in the United States can say yes. I mean, I remember reading in this book years ago about this guy, Sylvan Hart, who lived in the mountains in Idaho. I think the book was called The Last of the Mountain Men. This guy like had his own forge and grew his own food and only went to town for like sugar and tea. But like, that is an incredible extreme to go to, which most people are not going to go to. And anyway, so at Zendik, like, there were our per capita income was about $5,000 or $6,000 a year. So very, very low. And we did build our own buildings and grow some of our own food, not close to all of it, and did our own electrical work and plumbing and so on and so forth. But we were so not self-sufficient, and we were so very reliant on the cash that we would go out and, pull in from the death culture, as we called it.
I hope you don't mind me asking this. Do you still have any of those T-shirts, the ones that you used to sell?
You know what? I actually do, and I came by it in a strange way. So when I left Zendik in 2004, I owned a bunch of Stop Bitching Start a Revolution T-shirts, and I had a Circle Z amulet and all this stuff. And I deliberately decided to leave all of it behind, because I imagined it would just be too painful to have reminders with me of how I had failed. However, that first year after I left, I was out west and I was hitchhiking, I think from Arizona to California. And I passed through this little town in New Mexico. Yeah. And the guy who was giving me a ride was like, I'm going to drop you off at this store because I think you're going to like it. And he did. And I went into the store, and it was like a health food store, but it sold other things as well. And I was looking for organic food. That was very important to me. And I found some carrots and some chocolate and some lettuce. And guess what? They had some Stop Bitching Start a Revolution American Apparel boat necks there as well. And at the time, I mean, I had very little money. At that time on my person, I probably had about $50. And I bought for, I think, $26, one of those boat neck shirts, because I thought this is a sign, and this is, this is going to help me feel close to Zendik again. So, however, now that shirt, along with assorted other Zendik paraphernalia, is in a box in my closet. I did deploy it a few years ago to make the Kickstarter video for my book project. I put on the T-shirt and got out the sticker and impersonated myself as a Zendik.
Have you, like, right now, like, Helen, are you currently working on any other books right now?
Yeah, I'm working on a novel. It's set in 2024. It's based on my 7-year career, which is now over, as a college application essay editor. And the protagonist in the book is an editor, and she has a chance to influence the presidential election by revising and leaking the Common App essay of the Republican candidate's son. So that's my current project. And then a main theme running through it is the ancient enmity between the English and the Scots, which is fascinating to me.
Hello, thanks for listening to the Erratic Dispatches podcast. We'll be back shortly after a brief break.
And do you mind talking about like in the book you like about the different like they were sort of like a different bracelets? Is this sort of a hierarchy of the different like they're wearing and all that on the farm?
Yeah. So a couple of weeks after I arrived, so I noticed, I mean, soon after, right, I noticed that people had these little strips of cloth, different colored cloth around their wrists, but I just didn't think anything of it. And then somebody told me like, oh, those colors mean something, like there's a hierarchy, and the colors correspond to a hierarchy. And I was just like, that's ridiculous, there's no way that could be true. And anyway, I came here to get away from all that stuff. Well, it turned out it was true. There was an articulated hierarchy with what was called the family at the top. That was Errol and her daughter, and basically all of Errol's blood relations, plus people who had been at the farm for a very long time, and people who had been romantically involved with Errol and her daughter. So that was the top level. And then there were maybe like 5 or 6 levels total. The bottom one was green. Those were the Zendik apprentices. That's what I became, shortly afterwards. So yeah, and where you were in the hierarchy, it depended. I mean, being blood related to Errol or romantically involved with her, that was the best thing for rising in the hierarchy. But other factors involved, how long you'd been at the farm, how well you did on selling trips, things like that. And yeah, I mean, and then about a year after I got there, there was this watershed meeting in which Errol, yeah, we were asked to state our grievances against the farm, and we did this, not knowing that it was a trap. Then Errol yelled at us each individually for being so ungrateful and such. And then her daughter told us that we were in the habit of just, blaming the family and the people, the higher ups for our situation. But we, it was up to all of us to make the revolution work, and she didn't want any hangers on. So, from this moment on, you're either in or you're out. Raise your hand if you're in. And she abolished the wristbands. But it just didn't matter because nothing actually changed. And we all knew exactly where we were in the hierarchy at any given time. I mean, at least I knew.
And was there ever like any instances where like somebody would come into the farm and they thought maybe they would be part of Zendik, but maybe they left at a very short time span, maybe like a few days, and they're just like, or they disappear, like the next morning they're just not there anymore? Was it sort of like that, like kind of transient, sort of like people coming in and out?
Yeah, I mean, there were plenty of visitors. That was a common thing. Sometimes people came just for a short time, and they knew from the beginning it was just going to be for a short time. Other times people came thinking that they were going to move in, and then they got there and decided no, they were not going to move in at all. That definitely happened. I mean, as far as people just, leaving in the night or, ghosting after a couple of days, I don't know. I don't really remember that happened a lot, but certainly there was a lot of a lot of people just came to visit, to check it out, and then went on their way.
And talk about about the farm. Was it just like really beautiful there? Like this is scenery were you very overwhelmed there by everything?
Well, I mean, I actually don't think it was especially beautiful. It was a little bit scraggly, actually, the farm in North Carolina. Maybe other locations of Zendik were more beautiful than it was, but I guess it was. I mean, when I say that, I'm kind of talking about the landscape nearby, like the mountain we were up against. But over the years, we did make the Zendik property quite beautiful through, countless hours of labor. We built this huge, gorgeous cordwood kitchen dining hall, And then there was also a building called the Tree House, which actually had a tree growing through it. It was also quite beautiful. All the buildings were, I mean, some of them were older buildings that had just been repurposed, and then some of them we built ourselves. They were all, you know, a lot of them were, some of them were pretty Spartan, but they were all, you know, pretty nice looking. And then we built tons of terraces, you know, on the slopes. We, you know, harvest stones from the river and build these walls. And there were, you know, gorgeous flower beds that Errol took care of, you know, around the houses. So yeah, I mean, but that particular landscape never really caught my imagination. You know, I spent time in Idaho, in the Sawtooth Mountains in Idaho, when I was in college, working there during the summers, and that was the place that I always, you know, thought of as the most beautiful place on earth. And really, for me, the landscape and the geography of Zendik was never like a huge draw. However, strangely enough, let's see, in 2016, I returned to that area to visit an eco village called Earth Haven, which is only about an hour away from the old Zendik farm. And I've kind of fallen in love with Earth Haven and the land there, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, I think maybe just being at Zendik for 5 years, even if I wasn't so enthusiastic about like the place,
mm-hmm.
still I think that geography kind of worked its way into me, you know, and kind of helped me become fond of it. And now I kind of feel like that part of Western North Carolina, it feels like one of my homes, you know.
What type of life skills do you think you obtained when you were there that you're most proud of?
Yeah, so one thing is we worked together a lot, like on big crews, or even just to, you know, clean up after meals and stuff. And I became really sensitive to workflows and where in any given workflow the holdup might be, and kind of developed a habit when I'm working with people of just noticing how the whole flow is going and noticing where I can be most useful. And another thing that I'm proud of is I was not naturally good at selling. I was absolutely petrified of approaching strangers in the street and trying to get money from them for our stuff. And I think it was actually it was a really good thing for me in the long term that I wasn't naturally good at that, because I had to prove to myself that I could do this hard thing. And I never became like amazing at it. There were people who are, you know, pretty much blowing me out of the water most of the time. But I did develop a degree of skill and confidence at it. And one thing that I learned from that was, one thing I learned, I remember a particular concert that I was selling at was a fish show in Miami. And you know, often when I would sell, I would just sort of say the same thing over and over again. We all had our raps that we gave. But I remember this one time I decided, instead of giving my rap, to just have conversations with people and like say hi and say one thing and then let them say something back to me and then respond. And I did incredibly well that night, you know, and that was good information. And another thing that happened when I was out selling at Zendik, I became very sensitive to energy flows. And there were times when I was out selling when I just felt what I would call agape, like this sort of upwelling of love for my fellow human beings. I mean, that's not a skill, But I think it's a precious thing to feel. It's precious to know that that's available. And ever since, because I felt it there, I'm kind of able to summon it in other situations and also kind of use it as a North Star. Like, am I able to have that feeling or a version of that feeling? And if I'm able to summon it to any degree, then I know I'm on the right track.
And like at the farm, was there ever any pressure like for like, the younger people there to go on walks or to initiate like a sexual encounter with somebody? Was there anybody there like who just didn't want to do that? Maybe they were like celibate. Was there anything like that? Any kind of conflicts like that happening at the farm?
Well, I would say sometimes there was pressure to get together with someone who you were not necessarily all that interested in. Yeah, I think that's the most common version of that. Sometimes that would happen because two people were really just exclusively interested in each other. And that was, threatening, according to Errol, to the community at large. And so those people would be pressured to have dates with somebody else. And then they might go ahead and do that just to get the pressure off their relationship. But I don't remember encountering people who were just like not into sex at all.
Mm-hmm.
It was more like maybe they were getting together with people who were not their first choice.
And I read like one of your essays on a website about how you sort of reached out to some of the guys who you had like, walks with or encounters with, and I guess you felt like you've hurt them, but that was because you were sort of pressured to end that relationship with them.
Yeah. A number of times at Zendik, I was pressured to end the relationship, and when it really wasn't over at all for me. And so then years later, I needed to reckon with that. And then there was a man I went on a walk with when he was very new. He was a visitor, and I asked if he wanted to kiss, and he said no, and I kissed him anyway. And I did apologize for that years later. At the time, I just thought, well, I'm a Zendik and he's straight out of the death culture, and I know better than him, but I didn't.
And then are there like, are you aware of like a lot still like similar communities of like Zendik going on right now in this country? Or do you feel there's like more communities now, less communities than like 20 years ago when you were involved?
Well, if I had to guess, I would say there's probably a similar number now, and of course there's, different versions of groups, right? There's like the actual healthy, intentional communities that have clear structures for how people interact and who has power and so on. And there are plenty of those that are thriving. Then there are the honest to goodness communes like Twin Oaks and Eastwind, where people share resources and so on. And as far as I know, those places are thriving as well. And then there are the cults, which is the bucket where I usually place Zendik. And, I think of the 12 tribes, like that was maybe a similar group. I mean, as far as I know, they're going strong. I think there are in all those buckets, there seem to be, there seems to be a lot of activity.
Like I wonder now, like this kind of, because there's just so much cynicism going on now in the country, with everything going on, maybe more people would want to form more collectives.
I think something that could cause someone to, go off grid or or move to intentional community or enter a cult would be, you know, uncertainty, or just, wanting to be, what, maybe part of it, which I think is actually a positive impulse, is wanting to be part of a unit that you feel that you have some control over. You know, like the United States is huge, and like, no, your individual vote all by itself is just not going to do much. And also, I mean, humans evolved in bands and villages where everybody knows everybody else, and the leaders are accountable because they're living with the people they serve every day. And when you're part of a smaller group and you sort of create your own world, you know, there is something empowering about that. It's not just like, you know, this huge behemoth, you know, governed in Washington. It's like, okay, well, I'm part of this tribe, I'm part of this village, and I have a say in what goes on in this microcosm.
And do you mind talking about, like, how did your own family feel about you being involved in Zendik, either at the time and then afterwards? What was their perspective on it?
Yeah, I mean, at the time, they were not enthused. They were quite concerned. My mother and one of my sisters both came to visit me. I think they each came twice, so they sort of got a firsthand glimpse of what it was like there. A brother also came to visit me at one point. Yeah, I mean, I would say all of them were definitely concerned, and, you know, were wishing that I would leave. My mother in particular deliberately chose to just, you know, continue to let me know that she was there for me, but not to try to influence me to leave, which was very wise on her part, because then when I did leave, I knew that she was there. And I also got an inkling of conditional versus unconditional love. You know, I knew that if I was in dire straits, I could call her and she would care and she would help. And I also knew that that was not true of the Zendiks. As far as like their perspective after I left, I mean, in the time after I left, but was still kind of mentally and emotionally caught, I remember one of my sisters just getting really, really angry, you know, at Errol, which I understand now. She was like, I wish Errol would just die and this would all be over. Of course, Errol didn't have to die, you know, I just had to change my perspective. But I think that, you know, eventually, of course, the wounds healed. I certainly had some amends to make in terms of, well, not entirely cutting my family off. I never entirely cut them off. Like, I'm not going to talk to you. I just sort of emotionally cut them off in the sense of not really being fully present with them or telling them what was actually going on with me. But I mean, at this point, I would say, you know, it's all good, you know. Just, yeah.
And I guess do you still have that follow the perspective of just like being very suspicious of mainstream culture, or, you know, death culture?
Well, yes and no. I mean, I'm regularly, like, in my mind, in conversation, in writing, you know, calling bullshit and all kinds of things. In particular, I'm just aware that we humans are part of the web of life, you know, and it's not the environment, it's not something outside us, it's not optional. It's like air, water, soil, and relationships. Like, those are the things that matter, that we can't live without. You know, let's pay attention to that. But at the same time, I guess I've come to accept the world as it is, and even love the world as it is. I don't feel like the world has to be different for me to have an amazing life or make a contribution or, be part of it. I'm like, I'm more interested in like really grappling with the challenges and the dissonance I encounter than trying to, get away from them. Like money, for example, I read this book years ago, Sacred Economics by Charles Eisenstein, in which he talks about how all money is created as debt and therefore can't help but compromise the web of life just by existing. And I was like, yeah, that's right. And I'm going to create a gift circle, and I'm going to live in the gift economy and so on. Meanwhile, my husband was paying the rent. And so for years, I was just like basically operating on the idea that money is evil. But it sucks because I can't get away from it, like you need it to live. But recently I don't know, the past few years or so, I've just started to like, just really pay attention and to how I interact with money, and also open up to new stories about it. Like, sure, money might have inherent flaws, but at the same time, if people like me, who, have an awareness of my effect in the web of life and, do my darndest to have it be a positive effect. If people like me are like, money's evil and I don't want it, then people like Jeff Bezos maybe just are going to have more of it, and are going to, and if money amplifies who you already are, and I know that I am basically a generous, conscientious person, then I'm going to become more of that if I make more money, and so on. So just yeah, I mean, I consider myself, curious and inquisitive. I'm also aware, because of my Zendik experience, I'm aware that I am capable of getting trapped in stories, of thinking that something is a fact when it is not, when it's totally optional. And so I do get stuck in my own stories, and I do join my own cults. It totally happens. But I get out because I know that can happen.
Do you still, like, when you're like asleep at night, do you still like ever have like vivid dreams of being back at Zendik Farm?
Well, that is an interesting question. So in the I don't know, year, 2 years, 3 years, right after I left Zendik, I used to do this exercise, morning pages, Julia Cameron's thing, where you just write 3 pages in the morning. And I would often write down my dreams, and the dreams were often about Zendik. And I went back through these morning pages notebooks, and I stuck a piece of paper into every spot where there was a Zendik dream, and there were so many Zendik dreams. And over the years, I mean, occasionally I still have a Zendik dream, but as I've processed the experience, the dreams have just dramatically changed. Like when I first left, I would often have dreams where I was pushing back against people in a way that I never had at the farm. Like I remember I had one dream where everyone in the group was gathered together and they told me I was a nudge. And I was like, I am not a nudge. And I, of course, would never have said that at Zendik. So I was having these, my early dreams were very fraught. I was working stuff out. And then over the years, the quality of the dreams changed into just a much more relaxed feeling. Like I would in a dream, I would be with a bunch of former Zendiks, and we would be at a place that was sort of like the farm, but not really. And, and we would just be like hanging out and talking and, yeah. So nowadays, I mean, I hardly ever dream about Zendik anymore, but yeah, it just, whatever dreams I have now are just very, very relaxed. It's kind of like I'll meet old friends in my dreams now.
And when you're writing your book, was it like really easy to just kind of flow out of you, or was there any parts of it that were painful to reflect back on?
Well, so okay, so when I wrote my first draft, I wrote it all by hand, and I just wrote like 3 pages a day in a notebook, like every day until I was done. Well, I wrote towards the end. I was at an artist colony, and I wrote 20 pages a day, and that it wasn't emotionally difficult at all, as I recall. The difficulty really just lay in the discipline of writing those pages every day. Later on, when I was much farther along in the process, like I think it was the very last draft that I did, when I was really just, making sure that every word was really the exact word I wanted to use. I think it was during that revision that I really found myself grappling with all these relationships that had ended before their time, and just like really feeling grief for those things. And then there is one scene in the book, involving some sexual violence. That was probably the hardest scene to write and refine. But I think, so much of my memory of working on the book just has to do with learning the craft of conveying experiences in ways that would be vivid and clear to other people. So that's most of what I remember, is just, everything I had to learn about telling a good story.
Do you think you'll continue writing about Zendik, like in the future, like, any other like stories about your experiences with it?
Well, it's not impossible that I would. I mean, it continues to be a topic that fascinates me. And also, I think I've done a pretty good job of conveying what I wanted to convey in this book. I mean, I another thing that interests me too, though, is the experiences of other former Zendiks. There's one other Zendik, Jeannie Nolan, who wrote a book. It's not about Zendik, but Zendik plays a big part in her story. But she and I are the only two people and then there's another guy, his pen name is Roman McClay. He wrote a book called Sanction, which has a lot of sections in it that are taken from his Zendik experience. But most former Zendiks are not going to be writing books about their stories. And I would love it. I would love it if more former Zendiks would tell their stories, whether by, talking or being interviewed or writing it down or whatever. And also there's this blog, Purple Earth, I believe it's called, a man called Avi, who lived at Zendik for, I think, 14 years. He wrote a very long post about his time there, telling his story, and then a bunch of other Zendiks showed up and shared parts of theirs. So I'm really glad that all those stories are out there. But yeah, I think at this point, in terms of Zendik, I'm maybe more interested in hearing other people's stories than I am in telling more of my own. And also I'm really interested in my Zendik story and my Zendik experience as a third thing, as something that brings up lots of themes and questions and ideas that are relevant to all kinds of other aspects of my life and of how our culture functions.
Since you're a mother now, like, how would you feel if your kids approached you at some point down the line and they said that there's a community that they wanted to check out, would you feel hesitant about that? Would you warn them, or would you be open-minded about that?
I'm actually not a mother.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you.
No. But I think I can still answer the question.
Okay.
If a young person
Mm-hmm.
whom I loved were to come to
Mm-hmm.
me and say,
Mm-hmm.
"Hey, I want to join this community," what would I say? Well, I would probably I might attempt to arm them with some questions to ask about whatever group they were interested in that might yield clues as to whether it was a healthy group or a problematic one. Not that there's a clear division there, but there's kind of a continuum. But I mean, I would probably do that. And I might attempt to convey that the number one most important thing when you're in a group of people is to stay in touch with the wisdom of your body, to trust yourself, to do that, and ultimately, I think what I would aspire to do is let this person, like my mother did, know that I'm here for you. You can talk to me anytime, and I release you to go on your own journey.
Interesting. And Helen, did you want to share any final thoughts with the listeners to this podcast about your book, or just your writing in general, just your life experiences?
Well, something I've been thinking about recently is mistakes, and how, one could certainly say that my entering Zendik and giving them all my money and so on, that was a mistake. But I don't think it was. And there's this idea that I've come across recently in a coaching program I'm part of about decisions, that there's no such thing as a right decision. There's only the decision you make and making the decision right. And so I entered Zendik all those years ago, and I gave them all my money, which was a powerful incentive to make it work. And, maybe at some point in my journey, I would have said that was a mistake or that was the wrong decision. But maybe the thing about making a decision right is that sometimes it just takes a little while, and so, yeah, I would just advocate for the embrace of everything that is part of your life. It's all compostable. It's all a source of fertility, and you can make any decision right.
Great.
Hello, thanks for listening to the Erratic Dispatches podcast. We'll be back shortly after a brief break. Thanks again for tuning in to this latest episode of the Erratic Dispatches podcast, featuring an interview with my guest Helen Zuman, author of Mating in Captivity. For the Anchor FM profile page on this podcast, I've pasted several links. One is to Helen's official website. Another is to purchase Mating in Captivity. And for those of you who do read the book, please be sure to leave a review either on Amazon or Goodreads. And also there's an article as well that's called 50 Shades of Community. For those of you who do listen to my podcast, I do have sponsorships, and there is a link on the Anchor FM page and also my official website for any kind of donation or contribution to my podcast would be greatly appreciated. And I'll be back soon with a new episode. Take care. Bye-bye.